Hi everyone, and welcome to the recording of our first Tuesday talk about heritage as part of the autumn programme for Redesigning Grosvenor Square. I'm Natalie from Make Good, and we've been working alongside Grosvenor to make sure people have the best opportunities to get involved in the project and influence the new designs. When we set out to redesign Grosvenor Square, we knew we wanted to do this with our neighbours and with other London communities, bringing together the best knowledge to create a new type of urban square, which encourages discovery and fosters well-being. Our aim was always to create a shared vision between Grosvenor, our local and London communities, and the design team. We've used the feedback from our summer exhibition, where we tested initial designs, to shape the developing design ideas that we're sharing and testing with you in the exhibition and throughout the programme of events this autumn. If you haven't already, you can visit the square until the 20th of October or go online to grosvenorsquare.org to see all of the information displayed and have your say on the developing design ideas. Of the 6 key sets of information that we are sharing and testing about the developing designs, a very important one is heritage. You told us that you wanted the new designs to reflect the history of the square and to know more about how we've been working with this, so we've prepared some information that has inspired our ideas. I will now hand over to Cordula Zeidler from Donald Insall Architects, who is our heritage consultant advising Grosvenor and their design team on the historic significance of the square. Cordula delivered an inspiring walk and talk for us in the square on the 6th of October, and this is an abridged version of the talk, and unfortunately due to social distancing measures and safety guidelines, we were unable to record the question and answer section of the event from the audience. If you have any questions or comments about heritage, please include them in your feedback by going to grosvenorsquare.org.
Thank you for coming. I know it's not the nicest weather, so thanks for being out. So what I thought I would do is to talk a little bit about this bundle of images that you've got in front of you, which goes through the history of the square that has changed, quite a lot over time and has had so many interesting layers and redesigns. And then talk a little bit about the end, what we do in terms of trying to respect its heritage, who we talk to, you, but also through the planning process, we're talking to Historic England and Westminster Council, telling you a little bit about these conversations and asking you, most importantly, what you think is the most important thing about the square's heritage. What do you think is important about its history? What would you like to see retained or strengthened or brought back? Because this is an ongoing conversation we're having with everybody at the moment, and it's really interesting and not easy to come to an easy conclusion to. So we have a lot of maps here on one sheet, but what was really fascinating and groundbreaking when this square was first built in 1726 was the fact that this hadn't really been done before in London. A square which had soft landscaping, which had plants in it, and which was set in the centre of an urban development. So streets with houses, and then at the centre a square, and yes, those existed before, but they tended to be just hard landscaped. So you would have horses and carriages driving across them, and they'd be finished in either compacted dirt or stone. But to have a landscaping scheme, that was new, and to have a square that had an oval shape, that was also something that really hadn't been done before. So it was really groundbreaking, and it influenced how a lot of the London squares that came later looked. So if you think about the typical London Garden Square, you normally have a big open area, and in the centre you have railings around something that's normally oval shaped or round and landscaped. And back then, maybe if you can see on this image here in the background, you can still see that beyond London there was rolling hills and more landscaping. So the 18th century idea was to bring nature back into the city. So you would have had essentially the best of both worlds. So there were thinkers and gardeners who described this and said, this is the thing we must do. A movement which became the picturesque, so to have a landscaping backdrop to new architecture. And you can, on this map here, you can see just how important it was for the Grosvenor family who developed all of this. All of Mayfair was developed in one go, and Grosvenor Square was at the centre of it. This was really, the place to go, and the central landscaping feature was here. The two maps here at the bottom show that in the 19th century, essentially the square grew a little bit. It became sort of fat around the edges. So the pure oval shape was lost, and they planted a sort of a perimeter of trees around it. In the centre, right from the beginning, there was a statue of George I on a horse. So you can probably make that out on most of those maps. So that was the central focus point. He was surrounded by planting, but there he sat, and he was actually on a raised area. So there was a bit of a mound, and then the statue. So that was the thing to look at. We're making a big jump now across the centuries. So if we ignore this map and look here, the 20th century really completely changed the square, and I know you're all aware of it. It's no longer what it was. We no longer have a statue in the centre, but what we have instead is a new landscaping scheme. So the map over here with all the coloured buildings shows what happened in terms of war damage. So the London County Council recorded which buildings were bombed, and that included, here in pink, those buildings. That's the site over there, which was then replaced with the new American embassy in the late 1950s, early 1960s. That building here, which is being converted into a hotel now, as you know. And that really attracted the square being used in a different way, if I can say so. So once the American embassy was there, with its landscaping, which I'll talk about in a minute, that attracted, the square became politicized, essentially. People came here to demonstrate. Some of you might remember this, 1968, big demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and really violent protests that ended up in a lot of arrests, and certainly a big political event. We're sort of slightly back to front here. But what had happened before the embassy was built was that the square was completely re-landscaped. So the map you can see over here shows that it went away from the centralized design with a horse in the middle and paths radiating outwards. What we had instead was a new sculpture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, put up by the Pilgrim Society, so a group of people who came together and said he must be remembered here in the middle of Mayfair because the square has a long-standing association with the Americans. So during the Second World War, the military headquarters were there on the north side of Grosvenor Square, and Eisenhower had his UK headquarters here. In the 18th century, the first US ambassador lived over here on the other corner, so he had a house there at number 9 over there, and I think that's got a plaque that remembers him, doesn't it? So that there has been this ongoing American history, and that then culminated, it really resulted in Grosvenor Square itself becoming what I think people then called Little America or Eisenhower Platz. Right. So, a long American history, starting in 1785 with the American embassy, as you rightly say, having moved over there from a different location on the square. So the Americans were associated with Grosvenor Square, and then in 1947, when the statue of Roosevelt arrives, this becomes newly landscaped, and it becomes public, very important. So it goes from a private square to a square that everybody could access, and that was done by Act of Parliament. And this Act of Parliament also said that Grosvenor Square would be a place of remembrance. So it really changed from a London garden square to a place of remembrance. And that was a very different character. And obviously it was, at that point just after the war, this was highly significant for people who had just been through the war and who wanted to have an area where they could remember how things had been in the war and what had happened, and maybe also what could have happened instead. So the Roosevelt statue was enormously important, and what has happened, of course, since then is that the square has attracted more memorials, which essentially have grown a memorial landscape. So the Eagle Squadron's memorial, several of those, is on axis with Roosevelt, and that was put in the 1980s. So those two talk to each other. So those were the fighter pilots which volunteered to take part in the war before the USA joined the war. So they volunteered, and many of them gave their lives, and their names are all remembered on the obelisk. So highly significant. And those two memorials are listed, so they're protected. They're both Grade 2 listed in their own right. And of course, you know about the 9/11 memorial, which has arrived recently, and which remembers, as you rightly say, the British citizens who very sadly died in the 9/11 attacks. And not here at the moment are the two sculptures, the two statues to Reagan over there and Eisenhower. They've been taken offside so that the hotel construction can take place, but at the moment the agreement with the developer is that they will both be brought back. So that's what's agreed with Westminster City Council. There are many more images here, which I think maybe if you want to look at those in your own time, but these are to do with essentially with the FDR sculpture being put here and the significance of it. So we're seeing the sculptor, a man called William Reed Dick, who was a really important artist at the time, making that sculpture of Roosevelt. The landscaping around it, so the long path and the water fountain, the water basins and the steps, so all that setting was designed by an architect called Bertram Gallinaw, who had essentially friends on the Pilgrims Committee, so he was brought in to design the setting, but that was done alongside the sculpture. So in terms of where we now, understanding all this history and trying to feed it into a design and trying to bring some of it back, hang on to those bits that remain that are important. What's been really interesting is the square is registered at Grade 2. It's a bit like listing, but not quite the same. So it means you can do landscaping works without consent, but if you want to do anything bigger, you need to speak to Historic England and the Gardens Trust. So you need to seek permission. And with that registering goes a piece of text which explains what is important about Grosvenor Square, and that's just been rewritten to be longer and have more of an explanation. So we've been really grateful to have that. That came through about a year, 18 months ago. And that sets out very clearly that the importance of Grosvenor Square is it was a pioneering Georgian square in 1720. It was the first of its kind, and that is very, very important. Without it, London garden squares might all look very different. So we must remember that, and we mustn't lose the last vestiges of that we can still see, essentially. And the second layer of significance is the US layer, the memorials and the fact that Grosvenor Square is associated with the Americans. So we've been trying to build on both of those and strengthen what's been lost about the Georgian geometry. So make it oval again, and not have a focus that's away from the center, but essentially a design which focuses more on the middle. So trying to build on that Georgian ambition and have more planting, because this was meant to be for the enjoyment of residents. It was the green amenity. There aren't many trees in Mayfair, never have been, so this is the place where you're meant to go and enjoy nature. So building on that we thought was very important, and the architects have developed that. And then the American layer. So hanging on to all the memorials around it, because they all are important. They're important to us. Most of them are there for us to remember events that are quite recent. So we've all lived through them, or some of them at least. But part of the design is to remove that hard setting, so this hard landscaping that comes with FDR. Now we're having discussions at the moment with Westminster City Council and Historic England about this. Is this the right thing to do? Do we have the balance right between bringing back the Georgian ambition and respecting the US history? And different people have very different opinions about it. We don't all agree, so we're in the middle of a negotiation process about it. So what we thought would be really interesting to ask you, what do you think is the most important thing about the history of Grosvenor Square? What do you think should be kept or brought back or strengthened? What is important about its heritage? Maybe something that's been lost, or maybe something that still survives. So we'd be really interested to hear that. I mean, you don't have to tell us now, but you can write it down. But yes, if you want to tell us now, that'd be brilliant. What we feel is that they're both important, and you can't. So part of the design. So maybe let's find the best image to bring that back. Maybe one we haven't yet looked at. Yes, this one's brilliant. So this is one of my favorite images here, because it shows the shape, which is beautiful. It gives you quite big edges around, in all four corners, and it's a beautiful shape. And in the middle you have sort of more organic planting. At the moment you just have lawn and trees, and that's it. But in here, this is the late 18th century design. You had these clumps of shrubbery, so there were sort of bushes and little trees together, and they were slightly organic, so they weren't regimented and geometric. They were actually slightly wild. Yes, exactly. So they were everywhere. And then you had a sort of essentially a cross of paths, and then a path around the outside. So it was called wilderness work at the time. That's how people described it. And we thought that was interesting. That would be lovely, and that would be very Georgian, and could be brilliant for people who live here, and also help with things like microclimate, collecting water, and so on. So all the things that become more and more important as things heat up, as the climate heats up. But then keep the 20th century sculptures within that setting, and sort of trying to bridge the gap between the two. What exists today is the American landscaping. Yeah, the sort of this big path, and the fact that there's just lawn and trees and sculptures. The focus, the most important thing about the landscaping today, as it is today, is the sculpture. So it's designed so that you look at particularly the statue of FDR. So the whole square was redesigned in 1947, that this is your point of attention. And that's great, but it's also maybe not everything that a London square should do. Maybe it should do more. But the first design was very geometric, much more geometric. So this design is the first design. This is exactly the very first design was geometric, but it had plants in it, and that in itself hadn't really been seen before. And then it became, that's the first design as well. That's a different map of that first design, exactly. And it became simplified. In the 19th century, it became a bit larger. That is the main point here. And the other thing they did was, the Georgians had elm trees here, and they were taken out in the 19th century. So this is not something you can see on a map, but we know that. So they replaced the elm trees with plane trees, as you can see today. So the tree species was changed at that point as well. I mean, it's interesting about the heights, and you were saying how, if I understand you correctly, how tall he is. And there have been discussions about whether, would he be, if we brought him down slightly, keep all the inscriptions, would he actually be more approachable? Because he's quite imposing. During the Cold War, it was very important to have this show of strength. And it's interesting, I've spent quite a lot of time going to the former Soviet Union, and every town you go in there has a square or a place where you have a very tall, elevated sculpture and a hard landscape setting. So it happened on both sides of the Iron Curtain, where both sides demonstrated that they had a very important influence on how the Second World War went, and they were victorious. And that found its expression in landscaping and sculpture, and that's what we've got here. And it is really important, but does that mean it cannot change at all? So maybe there are degrees.
We hope you enjoyed this snippet of the Tuesday talk on heritage. For more information about upcoming events, to view the exhibition online and have your say, please go to grosvenorsquare.org. Thank you.